I would have been happy to do this for almost any thing that the HAHS would have requested, but to do it for Robin Judd and Robin Judd's book is an honor of the highest order, and partly because I've admired Robin's work for so long, and I admire Robin, okay, book or no book. But this is a book that really speaks on so many levels, on so many issues. And so I think it's an important contribution to our just knowledge of the military history, World War II, the place of Jews in American life, and more, which we're going to hear from. So I think maybe the best way to begin is for me to just ask Robin, what's the origin of this book? What was the journey you took to get us to this momentous occasion of the National Jewish Book Award? How and why did you embark on this?
So the book's origin, Hasia, and thank you so much for being here. It is such a delight and thrill to be able to speak with you. The book's origin lies in two separate locations. The first in a 3-story brownstone in Yonkers, New York, where my grandparents lived on the very top floor. I knew that my grandmother had been a Jewish war bride. She didn't speak about her experience very much. She was a Holocaust survivor who tended to keep much of her past silent. And while I knew about her war bride experience, my assumption was that her experience was relatively exceptional. And I sort of included it in that sort of box of things that we're interested in when we speak to our loved ones and our grandparents and our extended family members. And so that was sort of one location. The other location was my classroom at the Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio. I started teaching the history of the Holocaust as soon as I arrived at OSU, and I wanted to teach it differently than how I had studied it, which is to say, I wanted to teach memoirs that had been written by women. And so the first memoir that I taught was Gerda Weissman Klein's All But My Life. And lo and behold, she ends her memoir with having been liberated by her future husband, Kurt. And then I started collecting these memoirs written by other female survivors, and one after the next describe meeting their future husbands, perhaps on the lines of fighting, like Leisha Rose does when she meets Isaac Rose, or perhaps after liberation, like Gina Turgell describes, or perhaps it was at a DP camp, like Lala Fishman. But all of these memoirs describe meeting military personnel. And all of a sudden I realized that my grandmother's experience, while unique because all experiences are unique, shared commonalities with this category that hadn't been studied, and I wanted to learn more.
Okay, well, that's really intriguing. And one of the most intriguing things, both about how you just told us and how the book is organized, is that it's like, these are great stories. There's a thorough, deep, methodologically sophisticated historical framework to this. But these are also, or this is a book also about real people with names, and it's the highest, I think, form of storytelling. And so can you talk a little bit about yourself as a storyteller as well as a historian?
What a wonderful question. Thank you. I think I became interested in history because it's an opportunity for us to tell stories that are grounded in reality.
Mhm.
I love the arc of stories, and yet I would probably say that I'm not a particularly creative individual in the sense of that I may not have the imaginative sense of creating stories out of nothing, right? My children, when they were little, I would tell them, the defenestration of Prague as a great, bedtime story, because I love history, and I love the ways in which we can narrate the stories of history, and so much of that has to do with people. One of my greatest frustrations with my first book, which I loved writing, but which was a very different book, was that many moments when I lost individual, right? Where I wasn't able to get into the granular, into the day-to-day of particular individual stories. That for me was something that I wanted to make sure that with whatever the next project would be, and this ended up to be the next project, that I would have the opportunity to tell the stories. And then what became really, really hard was to identify which stories wouldn't get told. This book focuses on 8 couples or so, with a few that come in and out in other ways. And in the notes, I try to kind of buttress or supplement and give examples to other similar cases. But there are so many stories I couldn't end up telling because in order to keep the narrative engaging and not to lose my audience, I really did want to focus on a few couples.
Can you say something about the ones you did choose? That's, I think, one of the hardest things generally historians face, because your books can't just be literal compilations of all your notes. So how did you choose those couples?
There were a number of vectors or considerations at play. One concerned the kinds of materials that I had been able to collect around the various couples. I tended to choose couples where there were interviews of one kind or another. Either I had done the interviews myself or there were other interviews elsewhere. I particularly was excited by those individuals where there were multiple interviews, so I could think about questions around memory and the production of memory over time. I wanted to have these couples be individuals that I had found elsewhere in the archival record, perhaps in chaplaincy reports, maybe in military reports and commander reports. Were there collections of letters back and forth? Were there diaries and memoirs? So many of the couples that I chose were individuals where there were a large number of different kinds of materials that I could engage with, that I could kind of weave together to tell a story. The other thing that I wanted to make sure that I could do was to push questions of place and time in terms of my narrative. One of my objectives in writing the book was to make clear that liberation meant very different things to different people at different times. And so that meant that I needed to have a couple or a few couples from North Africa and Italy, as well as couples that are liberated in Germany. Right? The liberation dates are going to be totally different there. One will experience liberation and perhaps meet the spouse in 1943 or 1944. Another may experience liberation in 1945 and meet the spouse in 45 or 46. I wanted to have Ashkenazi and Sephardic families. So women who and men who spoke Ladino, as well as men and women who spoke Yiddish or German or French. So I tried to pull my gaze as wide as possible. If I was going to write a transnational project, I wanted to make sure that I had exemplars of that transnational project.
Okay, that's amazing. And so just as a kind of guide, or to put this these couples, these wonderful stories into context, is it possible to give figures on how many such marriages took place? Is that sort of beyond the documentation?
It may be beyond the documentation, although given what the documentation suggests, we're looking at somewhere in the low 1,000s. Somewhere around between 900 and 1,200 is my sort of best guesstimate based on all of the chaplaincy reports, the war bride ship data, the wedding announcements. I mean, there's a number of different ways in which these couples might evade the formal registrar of being a war bride couple, particularly, let's say, if they come over as a war fiance, or if they choose not to take advantage of the American or Canadian subvention or even as we get into 1945 and beyond, their sort of facilitation of immigration. So there are ways in which we don't have a clear list, the number of these couples, but the number of them was really quite surprising to me. I started the project again thinking that, okay, maybe it was my grandmother and Gerda Weissman Klein, and then slowly but surely I started collecting more and more and more. And even just last week, I received an email from someone who introduced herself as the child of a war bride, and I hadn't seen her parents in any of the records. So I'm imagining that there are a fair number of them.
Okay, that's great. You know, in a way, it shows how even if a phenomenon is not enormous, a small phenomenon still sheds light on some really important trends. And I think, which I kind of want to shift to. And so you have, there are two kind of comparative questions I want to ask you. And I'll start with one, which is you have this as US, military, Canadian, and British. Okay, what would you say was the difference between the policies of these three liberating armies?
Thank you for that. And I should say that in the very beginning, I started the project, as you may remember, solely looking at the United
Right.
States. And as I began the research, I realized that there was no real way to write the project looking only at the United States, because there was so much movement across these zones of occupation. There was so much movement of the military personnel that to look at the United States was really only a slice. But that means that similarities and dissimilarities that come in and apart depending on the timing. So up until December of 1945, Britain and Canada, and it makes sense because Canada is a Commonwealth nation, Britain and Canada share almost identical policies around marriage and immigration of the war brides. And I should say, I'm using the term war bride. One could be a male war bride, like the Cary Grant movie,
Right.
I Was a Male War Bride. So Britain and Canada both had developed, before the Second World War, policies around war brides that set out that there needed to be commander approval for these marriages, and that once the couple was married, that the spouse, the civilian spouse, that individual's travel would be overseen and supervised by the Allied force. In the United States, they develop only after entry into the war a commander approval mandate. Earlier during the First World War, they had a very different war bride policy. The American forces are willing to offer a reduced rate for spousal travel, but the control of spousal travel gets introduced in December of 1945 when the US passes the War Brides Act. In 1946, it passes the Fiancés Act, and that highlights another difference, which is that Canada does not have a fiancés law. The United States has a fiancés law, and Britain has a fiancés policy. So that war fiancés, if there had been approval of the betrothal, that the fiancé could come to the US or could come to Britain. In Britain, there was a set period of time. In the US, it was a little bit longer before marriage could happen. In Canada, there wasn't a clear fiancé policy.
Okay, great. By the way, there is a question, so I'm going to take a moment away from my script and turn to somebody in the audience who's asked, and it's just the question one asks a historian: how did you do the archival research for this book? Where did you start? Okay, and I'm going to throw in, how many archives did you go to? So
So you may remember, Hasia, that when I started the project, I really did start with the memoirs,
Mhm,
because I thought that that would be one easy way of figuring out where some materials were.
mhm,
Uh, Memoirs help direct me to some of the testimonies, which then gave me a sense of, okay, well, where were some of the spaces? Who were some of the actors involved? That led me to think about the chaplains.
mhm,
And so I looked at chaplaincy material in the United States, in Britain, and in Canada. I looked at formal military records in all of those countries. I looked at Jewish newspapers, wedding announcements,
mhm,
because I had the sense that parents probably would want to announce the weddings of their children. They did. And that then allowed me ways to sort of access these couples, because of course there wasn't a box that said Jewish war brides. And so there were, by the way, boxes in the National Archives under war brides.
mhm.
And that helped me better understand some of the war bride policy, although there's wonderful work that's been done on the history of war brides. I worked in several different countries in the United States, Canada, Britain, Germany, France, Belgium, Israel, and worked at both Jewish archives, state archives, military archives. In some countries, there are archives that are part of the chief rabbinate. So in Britain, for example, the Jewish Board of Deputies was kind enough to give me access to the materials of the chief rabbinate. So there were many different ways in which I tried to access this material.
Okay, so for the person who sent in the question, it's a great question to ask a historian. And usually, as you just heard, the best answer is every place. Okay, and that one source leads to another. It's kind of like Hansel and Gretel's little trail of breadcrumbs in the forest. Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit to my question, and there's some others that have come in that are really good. Then I'll come back to those. You could have written this book with the organization, the framework being the United States, Britain, Canada, and it would have been a great book. Okay, but you chose a different structure. Can you talk a little bit about how the book is organized, how we get from the introduction to the conclusion?
This was a great post-tenure project, right?
Uh-huh.
This would not have been a
Mhm.
wonderful book for me to have written while I was approaching tenure, uh, because it allowed for me to out mush those parts together and then take those parts apart and then put them back together. So in many ways, I did write those sections because I had to. I had to understand what the narrative was vis-a-vis the US military policy on fraternization and marriage. I had to understand what laws around marriage in Germany versus Belgium versus the Netherlands look like. Uh, so I did write those pieces, but that then suggested some kind of comparative history that for me didn't really work. There were moments, and you and I spent, I know, many a breakfast talking about the structure of this book, right? That where I want there to be any sense of a clear comparison, but rather a relationship. This kind of notion of relational history, where how can we put these things side by side, and what do we learn from them? And so rather than think about structuring it as US, Britain, Canada, or Belgium, choosing all of the different countries, Italy, right, and a country on each, I tried to think through what were those moments when the men that I'm interested in, the survivors who marry military personnel, what were those moments when they are feeling the most liminality, where they are feeling the most sense of unbelonging,
Uh-huh.
where they are parts of multiple communities, but no communities. What does that arc look like? And once I asked myself that question, then I saw, marriage. Oh, they're immigrating when they arrive. And so what I did was I structured the book using those sort of 5 touch points with a brief interruption of what are those cases when they don't fit in at all because they receive rights to immigrate, but they're not allowed to, because those don't really fit into that last chapter. And what are couples where if we put those couples side by side, they're different enough that they allow us to see points of similarity, but points of difference. So for example, let's compare a couple that meet in Italy and a couple that meet in Northern Germany. Let's make sure that I have a Sephardic woman and an Ashkenazic man, right? So trying to kind of think through those different examples, and this goes back to the question that you asked earlier about how did you choose? Once I had that arc, then I could more easily slot in what were those couples that I would end up using. And some of them got swapped out, right? This book went through multiple drafts.
Okay, I could imagine. So let me now turn to a question that's come from the audience, and then again I'll go back to my prepared list of questions. So I'm going to hope the writing here is small. It's very small type, but I think I can get it. And it says, "What Sephardic and Mizrahi couples did you include in the book? Did they usually marry a similar ethnicity or Ashkenazim? For example, Salonican men met Hungarian women from Auschwitz or in the DP camp."
Yeah, it's a great question. All of the Sephardi Mizrahi women that I look at, and Floria Goda's picture that is on the cover, the fabulous cover. Thank you to the book designers. They did an incredible job. Floria Goda is a wonderful example of a woman who grew up mostly in Zagreb, makes her way eventually to Kursula and then to Bari. And it's in Bari, Italy, that she meets her Ashkenazic future husband. So there are a couple of examples like that in the book. And again, the majority of them are Sephardi women from either North Africa or in the case of Flori, who's from Yugoslavia, who marry Ashkenazic men. I had 2 examples I don't use in the book of Sephardi and Mizrahi women marrying men whose are of Sephardi kind of origin, although I didn't have as much material on them, and the material that I had as robust in giving me a sense of the military personnel's Sephardi identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is perhaps not a question. It's just going to be a statement, which you can respond to. So one of the things that really struck me from this book, and then what we know generally about Holocaust survivors, is these were young people, and most of them didn't have extended family. They mostly didn't have parents. And so they're in a way, it's such a dramatic story of people who make these matches by themselves, and they don't have any kind of communal pressure to whom to marry, family saying who they should marry or who they shouldn't marry. And it's really about a book about young people navigating the world on their own. And then so that's just a comment rather than a question, but
No,
it kept in my mind about the fact they don't have parents who are in any way hovering over them to approve or disapprove of the match they've made.
I think that's totally right. And I end the first chapter with a description of one of the women that I have personally grown quite fond of, right? Salah Bonder, who young and is constantly meeting young people after liberation. She is liberated with a small group of women from their death march. She then makes her way to Berlin, where again, she's sort of interacting with individuals who are around her age, late teens, early to mid 20s, eventually going up to Hanover at the DP camp, right? Most of the individuals around them are in their 20s or 30s. And so it makes sense to us that these individuals would cross paths in one way or another. And Salah meets Abe at Rosh Hashanah, at the DB camp. Abe Bonder had from Montreal, Yiddish speaking family. He had been very committed to meeting Jews as he was making his way into and through Germany. And so it wasn't unusual for him to go to Rosh Hashanah services at the Hanover DP camp. And he could speak to Salah in Yiddish, right? One of the things that fascinated me about some of the couples is some of the couples aren't able to communicate at all. But Salah and Abe could talk to each other in Yiddish. And as Salah said in one of her interviews, she didn't want to marry somebody from the camps, right? She wanted what she called a cheery American, even though he was Canadian. She said, we'd be talking about the camps all day if I married somebody from the camp. I wanted to marry someone who was cheery. And so I think this sort of sense of who is it that one wants for oneself, and what is the sort of strategy behind the creating of relationships was part of this story.
Yeah, I mean, that one of the things a couple of things you said were amazing. And we could go on just from your last answer and fill the whole hour. But the idea of, these particularly women coming into American and British and Jewish and Canadian Jewish communities, and their expectations of what those countries were like. And yeah, the cheery American. Okay, so here's a question that I was going to ask you, but one of the people in the audience asked, so I will put it in her words rather than mine. Do you see much intermarriage where the Jewish bride married a non-Jewish soldier? And we might, by the way, also flip it. And I'd like to throw in a Jewish soldier falling in love and marrying a non-Jewish, wanting to marry a non-Jewish woman.
So I write a little bit about these questions of endogamy in the book. During the Second World War, most commanders involved their chaplains pretty heavily in the vetting process in terms of before giving approval for marriage. And it was possible, but not always common for Jewish chaplains to give permission to couples to intermarry. We have some Jewish chaplains who say, I won't withhold my permission. I'll just hand this case back over to the commander, right? We have an example of Isaac Rose writing to one of his Jewish soldiers saying, I can't condone this. I can't give it permission, but at the same time, I'm not going to prevent it from happening. So we certainly have cases where intermarriage happens, but on the whole, more of the marriages that I see are Jews marrying Jews. Again, absolutely. There are many cases, and I write about some of them in the book, where Jewish women marry non-Jewish men, or Jewish men marry non-Jewish women. The way that I was able to keep some sort of hold on my project was to have the war brides be Jewish survivors. And so what I don't write about are Jewish GIs who are interested in marrying non-Jewish German women. Like, there were absolutely some, but that that sort of falls outside of the book and makes its way into the footnotes every now and then.
Okay, so something else that you could have done, you didn't, because obviously you have a particular project, but can you say anything about non-Jews? There's the Catholic, the Protestant, chaplains and the military, and cases of soldiers who want to marry, who want to marry women. Again, outside of the Jewish framework, was the policy and the procedure and the hoops that they had to jump through the same, different? Were there any complicating factors that distinguished them?
So similar to how I described Jewish chaplains, often Catholic and Protestant chaplains respond similarly. Ronit Stahl's book on American chaplains deals a little bit with this in her study. The Allied forces policy around fraternization and around marriage does not create exceptions for Jews. So I had to understand the policies based on place and time. They change over the course of 1945, and they often become very place dependent. So, for example, the Bonders in Hanover do not receive permission to marry from their Canadian chaplain because at that point the Canadian military did not allow for marriages on German soil. And that would have been the same if it had been a Catholic couple or if it had been a Protestant couple. In terms of marriage between a Catholic and a Protestant or a Catholic and a Jew, right? Again, those fell under the same larger policies, and the question would be up to the chaplain as to whether or not the chaplain would approve that marriage, and or whether or not the commander would approve the marriage.
Okay, so there are a few questions that have been written in that were actually dovetail with something I was going to ask. And again, it's beyond the scope of your book, but I have a feeling you can say something about it, which is, you bring these couples, they're now married or they get married in the place of destination. Can you say anything about the sort of what happens in terms of the marriage as it goes on, the possibly divorce rates, integration of the survivor into the and I'm going to assume again mostly it's the survivor woman into the family of the American or Canadian or British soldier, their role in the communities that where they set their children. Obviously, that's in some ways because we take us full circle back to your story about your grandmother. So what can you say about the trajectory after getting there and settling down?
The last chapter looks at that immediate period after they arrived, and in almost all cases, and again, there are always exceptions, but in almost all cases, the couples settle with the family of the military spouse. So in the case of Floria Goda, for example, she arrives off of the War Bride ship, and her husband, Harry, is accompanied by his siblings and father. They've driven in from Youngstown, Ohio, to come get her, and they call him Heschel, and they're speaking in Yiddish, and she is completely shocked and flabbergasted, right? And that begins her life in the United States. She first goes to Youngstown, Ohio, and she and Harry live in the Yagoda home. That was pretty common in terms of the narrative. And one of the things that really fascinated me was the sense of in-betweenness that these women and men, these war brides have when they arrive, because they're not necessarily grouped or seeking out other survivors, although sometimes they are, and it depends on their spouse and their spouse's family. They're not necessarily seeking out other war brides, but sometimes they are, and there are war bride clubs and war bride programs. And so they're navigating this. They're trying to kind of move among their spouses, family, and friends and networks, the survivor families and networks, the war bride families and networks, all in the same sort of space. Because most of the people that I look at are settling in places with Jewish communities. They're tending not to live out in rural areas where there's no one else. That was exceptional. It was much more common for them to be in Montreal or Toronto or London or New York or Chicago or Boston, Philadelphia, Madison, Wisconsin, or Milwaukee. So they're going to these cities, Columbus, Ohio. And one of the things that I know is that many of the women and smaller degree men talk about feeling a bit more grounded once they have children. And so I look at kind of those moments of the difficulty of this life cycle event without their families present, but also what having children does in terms of their own sense of reconstruction and recovery and rebuilding after trauma. I don't talk much in the book about divorce rates. Most of the couples that I look at remain married at least through the 1950s. And even then, they seem exceptional when they do divorce. One of the warning may be too strong of a word, but one of the caveats, that I always sort of throw out when I'm asked that question, that most of these war brides don't necessarily have homes to return to. They're different than the majority, not all, the majority of our non-Jewish war brides. The majority of our non-Jewish war brides have homes that they could return to if they get divorced. And in some cases, the US or the Canadian Red Cross will actually either cover or subsidize their return. So we do see women leaving Saskatchewan. Sorry if anyone on the call is from Saskatchewan, right? And heading back to London, or, leaving Columbus, Ohio and going back to Dublin. We don't see many Jewish survivors getting divorced and going back to Poland. Like that's just not a trajectory or a pathway. And so, yes, there are some divorce cases. I write about one of them in the book, but they're exceptional.
Do you have any sense of women receiving, shall we say, services of one kind or another from Jewish social service agencies or Jewish women's organizations like National Council of Jewish Women, which play a big role in helping settle survivors in general?
Yeah. So one of the things that I find fascinating, and maybe at some point we'll write an article about it, about where this goes, is that these women that I study, these Jewish survivors, often take part in two different set of kind of rehabilitation services of one kind or another, resettlement services. They take part in the services that are offered for survivors, and they often take part in the services that are offered for the war brides themselves. Sorry, that's my dog Stanley, who is very excited about the services that they were offered. So the war brides then sometimes have this sort of like double opportunity to take advantage, that they might take childcare classes with other non-Jewish war brides, and then they might take English classes sponsored by the National Council of Jewish Women with Jewish survivors. And so how that sort of helps to shape their identity, how that helps them to position, to take advantage of the systems and structures in the United States, Britain, and Canada, I think that matters. And I'm not sure, and this is where one day maybe I'll write this article, I do think this is why we see more memoirs written by the Jewish war brides earlier than we see memoirs written by other Jewish female survivors. I think they're more positioned, they're better positioned to write those memoirs and publish those memoirs than perhaps other Jewish female survivors.
They also have a live-in English-speaking spouse
Exactly.
who can help them just, with the process of writing and what was obviously not their mother tongue.
Yeah,
So,
that's exactly right. I mean, and so we'll see that. We'll see them taking advantage, if you will. They're some of the earliest to write the memoirs in terms of Jewish women who are involved in Holocaust education. They're some of the first to be involved in Holocaust education. They're some of the first to give testimony in terms of interviews. They are some of the first to take advantage of antibiotics for civilians, right? Like there's so many ways in which they're positioned in this space between military and survivor, and in some cases they navigate that well.
I mean, in a sense, it's a fascinating picture, I think, that you're conjuring up. And, on the one hand, most of the survivors are married to other survivors. And their clubs, their organizations are kind of survivor couples. And so one can sort of imagine multiple ways in which these war brides, because they're not married to other survivors, and do they fit into the New Americans Club or not? Do they have to come alone? Does the husband come with them? And which leads me to just a comment, which I'd like you to, though, then sort of embellish upon, is that if I had to think of one word that captures everything that's going on in this book, besides the resilience of these women and the amazing storytelling that you're doing, is the word messy. Okay, and you use it in a couple places, and every time you used it, I underlined it. And I think it, other than war bride, it may be one of the words that come up most often. And in a way, analytically messy, because you don't have a single model. But I think also the messiness of this process. It isn't, a kind of ordinary girl meets boy, boy meets girl, get married, fall in love, get married, but it's a really messy process. So can you, in a way, embellish upon that messiness that you refer to?
Well, as you can see from my office, right, mess does not scare me.
Right.
And I think that there's real value in sort of trying to sit with the very complicated nature of history. People are complicated beings. We're not easy to figure out. And I learned sort of early on in my teaching that I was doing a disservice to my students when I tried to paint a sort of easily swallowed narrative of history, that they sort of better engaged with and even better understood a more complicated narrative of history. And so I try to, both with my first book and with this book, try to write books that weren't neat, tied up sort of with a little bow, but rather sort of sat with the nuance and complication of the Jewish experience during and after the Holocaust, that allow us to see multiple pathways, multiple experiences, moments that are uncomfortable within the Jewish community. You mentioned, right, about the New American Club and do these women feel comfortable? There's a moment in my last chapter that still kind of brings me to tears because I hear the woman's voice where she describes how at some point her husband basically insisted that they stop going to the survivor clubs. He felt like an outsider. He wasn't comfortable there. He was much more comfortable at Rockaway with his family and his friends, and he didn't want them to be spending time with other survivors who were speaking Polish and to some degree Yiddish. Like that was not his world. And so want the Harlequin romance of Jewish war brides. I wanted sort of the more messy understanding of what these women's and men's stories were.
Okay, I mean, that's wonderful. And in a way, it's testimony to what a good historian you are, that you're not seeking like the answer. But yeah, I mean, whatever it is we study, it's always complicated, and there can't be one answer, because if it is, it's not a very interesting problem. Okay, so I want to turn to a few things, and I want to just say to the audience that we have about 12 minutes. So if you have some questions, this is your time to get them in. So on a very practical level, and this might be something that I don't know how else to, maybe through the AJHS, somebody asks, okay, what reading materials beyond the wonderful book would you recommend for learning more about DP camps, ward brides, and marriages?
So it really depends on who one is interested in studying. If one, I think of Tina Grossman's book,
Yeah.
Jews, Germans, Allies, is just a wonderful book to read. It really focuses mostly on one DP camp in Germany and the interaction among, it's obvious from the title, right, Jews, Germans, and Allies at that site. So that would be a wonderful place to go. I think if you're interested in the American war bride experience more generally, Susan Ziegler's book on on war brides is really, really wonderful. There's a fair bit of work that's been done on Canadian war brides as well. A bit less on British, but there's still a fair bit of literature, and there's a couple of kind of big war bride books. I think all of which are called The War Brides, different authors, same book title. And that will give you a little bit of a sense of the history of the war brides themselves.
Okay, great. So one of the questions comes from actually somebody I know, so Mark Slobin, and he just points out, and it's in the book, but perhaps to the audience, that Flori Jagoda really becomes such an important performer of Jewish music, and I had the privilege of hearing her a few times, and really kind of more than just a performer, but actually an ethnographer. And there's something so moving. I didn't realize in the time I'd heard her perform, and I had no idea she had this story. So it was really quite wonderful to see her come up in your book.
She
Okay.
was amazing. I will just say one quick thing, and that is that when I started researching and writing the book, my kids couldn't have cared less about it, I don't think. But once they knew that I was interviewing the woman who had written Ocho Candelicas, that changed everything.
Right.
Then they
Right.
loved the project.
Yeah, it's such a really good example of the impact of one of the war brides on American Jewish live American Jewish culture. Um, okay, so just there's another place in the world where this war was being fought, which was in Asia, primarily, and in the Pacific. Very quickly, because we don't have much time, and it's not what you wrote about, but I just wonder if you know anything about the way in which the U.S. military dealt with marriages between American GIs and Japanese women, since obviously there's an American occupying army in Japan.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And there's been also really, really good literature that has been written on sort of the ways in which race gets employed in the American context with American marriages in the Pacific. There are marriages in the Pacific, and that is a kind of shifting variable, the variable of race. And which changes with the Korean War in terms of how kind of the degree to which that can be used as a category to refuse rights to marry gets changed. So certainly, and I thought about, there was sort of a minute or two where I thought, like, oh, there are these Jewish women who are in Australia who are married, maybe I should look at them, but it was a totally different, narrative. The policies are different. In some cases, immigration is different. It really made sense to stay where I was.
Okay. And again, in the very short amount of time we have, I also want to just say that this is a really interesting book or important book about bureaucracy and how bureaucracies function, and in a way in the military, which is a bureaucracy as well as a fighting force. What can you say anything about just the was this bureaucracy ever amenable to being nudged, tweaked, or was it follow the rules exactly as they are?
I think it depends on time and place, and certainly I write about the bureaucracy a lot. Indeed, one of the big changes that I had to make to the book was to take out an entire chapter that was on waiting for paperwork.
Oh, that's too
Um,
bad.
that the editors, the readers said, no, nobody wants to wait. So there's a tremendous amount of bureaucracy, and there are certain points and places where that bureaucracy can get nudged, moved along. There are other places where it can be circumvented. So, for example, there's sort of a few moments where we'll see couples going to Prague or Paris to marry without receiving commander approval to do so. So there are kind of definitely examples where we see the circumvention, but it's a pretty rigid bureaucracy. And much of the chaplaincy material that I look at is trying to kind of engage with that. The, you know, Jews can't marry during these dates, and this individual is going to be demobilized by that date. So, can we hasten the approval process so that we can get the marriage done before, the summer? So there's sort of one of the things that I found really fascinating is what happens when the bureaucracy of the military and the bureaucracy of Jewish law meet. And that's something that I talk about a little bit in my chapter on marriage and courtship.
Okay, can you say something again? We just have such a brief amount of time, but it fascinated me, the difference between the American chaplains, who presumably represent all three denominations, from very liberal to through orthodoxy, versus the British chaplains, who I'm going to presume were primarily orthodox because of the institution of the chief rabbinate.
Yeah, I mean, I might frame the question slightly differently, which is that the Jewish chaplains in Britain are responsible to the chief
Okay.
rabbinate,
Mhm.
whereby the Jewish chaplains in the United States are not are responsible to the Jewish Refugee Board, but and so there you have responsa that they create during the Second World War, and some of their responsa deals with questions of marriage, what happens with an intermarriage, what if there's an Orthodox chaplain, but the couple wants to reform marriage, right? So they have those sorts of questions. You don't see that to the same degree in among the British chaplains, though you do have some reform or liberal British Jewish chaplains. In Canada, one of the things that really struck me is that the Canadian Jewish chaplains, at least on paper, took a stronger stance around endogamy. They don't always practice that stronger stance, but they sort of on paper make an argument that both individuals should have been born Jewish, which is interesting. They don't use the language of conversion, whereby the American chaplains talk about conversion much more. So there are differences among the chaplains and how they engage in questions around marriage.
Okay. Well, somebody wrote in a question, a pretty somber question, and I think I know what your answer is going to be, but I want to read it anyhow. And it says, were any of the war brides abandoned once they arrived in the US, and what happened to them? And we might even flip that, and I'm going to take it beyond that and say, did any of the war brides, once they got to the United States or to Canada or England, say, okay, now I got here, I don't have to remain married to this person?
Well, absolutely. In the larger war bride population, that's a real issue of abandonment. I have found a few examples but very few. And in fact, one of the things that I'd love to solve is that there's a murder case, a woman, a Jewish survivor who marries a, a band player. I think he's horn player. Is part of the military, and she immigrates. They live for maybe a year or two, and then she disappears. And the local police thinks it's murder, but a body is never found. So cold case, Jewish War Bride edition.
That's a great movie that you can make.
Yeah. So I'd love. I mean, I've started to try to collect a little bit more about that story, but I haven't found a lot yet.
Okay, well, we just have really at the very, very end of our time. And so I wonder if in the 2 minutes we have, if you might just reflect a little bit now with all the accolades and all the attention the book has got. How satisfied are you with the process and with what you accomplished?
I am very satisfied. I wish I could have written this book sort of 10 years earlier so that I could have shared it with Gloria Goda and Gina Turgal and, you know, the dozens of women who, when I started the project, made themselves available to meet with me, who passed away while I was continuing the research and or writing. So in that sense, there is that bit of sadness, but I've loved hearing from people who found themselves in this story, whether it was because they knew, you know, a war bride, their French teacher was a war bride, or they themselves were children of war brides. It's meant a lot to me that I was able to write the book in a way that could be accessible to somebody who just wanted to read it, who doesn't think of themselves as a historian, but that also that historians that I really admire, like you, Hasia, have enjoyed reading the book. So for me, kind of striking that balance, that's sort of the jackpot.
Okay, well, that's a wonderful both poignant note on which to end, and also one that I hope whets the appetite of all the people who have participated, and as well as those who will hear the the recording, to go out and read it themselves, and to really engage with these amazing stories. So thank
Thank
you so
you.
much.